Welcome to the interview series on the socioeconomic consequences of disruptive technologies by Rethinking Economics NL. In this interview, we'll be focusing on the labor market, especially how it's being affected by increasing automation, innovation in disruptive technologies, and the gig economy. For this, I'm honored to be able to introduce four world-class experts on these topics. First with us today is David Autor. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, full professor at MIT, and associate head of the MIT Department of Economics. He is also co-director of the MPER Labor Studies program and co-leader of both the MIT Work of the Future Task Force and the JPAL Work of the Future Experimental Initiative. His scholarship explores the labor market impacts of technological change and globalization on job polarization, skill demands, earning levels, and inequality and electoral outcomes. Secondly with us today is Pascual Restrepo. He is an assistant professor at Boston University in economics and a faculty research fellow at MPER. His current research examines the impact of technology, in particular of automation, on labor markets, employment, wages, inequality, the distribution of income, and growth. His theoretical work centers on developing micro-founded models of technology choice to think about the short and long-run implications of different technologies and whether the resulting growth process is balanced. Some of his earlier research focused on institutions, crime, violence, and illegal markets. Thirdly with us today is Maria Savona. She is a professor of economics at SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, and professor of applied economics at the Department of Economics at Lewis University. She was previously at the University of Cambridge and the Universities of Strasbourg and Lille 1. Her research focuses on the effects of technical change and innovation on employment and wage inequality, innovation in industrial policy, and structural changes. She recently works on political economy of data value. She is a former member of the high-level expert group on the impact of digital transformation on EU labor markets for the European Commission. Fourthly and lastly with us today is Vili Lehdonvirta. He is a professor of economic sociology and digital social research at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. He is also a former member of the European Commission expert group on the online platform economy and a high-level expert group on the impact of the digital transformation and EU labor markets. Lehdonvirta is an economic sociologist whose research focuses on digital technologies such as apps, platforms, and marketplaces, how they are governed, how they shape the organization of economic activities, and with what impact to workers, consumers, businesses, and policy. And with that, I'd like to go to the first question to Professor Autor. Could you tell us more about how disruptive technologies, such as AI and robotics, have been affecting labor markets in the last decades?
Sure. I mean, it's a big question and it's an open research question. And the people on this call or in this meeting will have, more expertise than I. Even Pascual has worked on this directly. I mean, I think so. Work that Pascual, Daron Acemoglu, and I have done along with Joe Hazel, who's a former PhD student, suggests that artificial intelligence as a starting point is affecting the set of tasks done by workers and displacing some activities in which machines have increasing capability, but we don't yet see large aggregate impacts. So I think that a lot of the discussion of AI at present is somewhat speculative. And I think the reason that it's, there's two reasons why it's such a focus of conversation. One is that, of course, it's novel and so it's exciting. But I think more substantively is we don't have a good roadmap of the way AI will evolve and what it will be capable of doing. So for previous generations of software and even technology, we had a very incremental set of steps. Before you could computerize or write something in software, you had to understand all the rules and procedures, and then you had to encode those. And so there was kind of a slow chipping away at problems. But artificial intelligence, because it doesn't use the same paradigm, because it's not a matter of first understanding and then encoding, but rather that you have a flexible technology that can in some sense infer the rules, we don't have a sense of what it will be good at or how quickly it will get good at those things. So I think there's an enormous uncertainty. And so, the work that Daron and Pascual and Joe and I have done is non-alarmist. It says not that much actually, as far as we can measure it, has happened so far, but I don't think we take that as comfort that nothing will happen. I'll just defer the question of robotics to Pascual, because I really think he will, and others who will have a more authoritative answer.
That's perfect. The next question I also prepared for Pascual. Could you expand as well on your research, especially as Professor Autor also mentioned? So how does it, I think you focus especially on automation. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I see, and as David already explained, like AI is too soon to tell, but I see most of our research as kind of like exploring previous waves of automation and trying to learn something of how was the process of adjustment, who were the winners and losers from these previous waves of automation, and so on, right? So like, I think that when we think about technology, we as economists tend to think that technology generates winners and losers. And sometimes we focus a lot on the winners, like as a society as a whole becomes more wealthy and richer and so on. And those are the benefits of technology. But I would say that a lot of my research with Daron and now with David has also been about like trying to understand who are the losers and trying to quantify how big are the losses in terms of wages and gainful employment opportunities. So for example, in the case of robotics, we've analyzed this question by looking at local labor markets in the US adopting robots. And we found that in these communities where more robots are being adopted, you see some declines in employment and wages. More recently, we have been looking at what happens to workers who tend to specialize in those industries where you're seeing more automation and at the jobs that are precisely the targets of this automation. And what we have documented is that these workers have experienced less wage growth and a decline in their employment opportunities during the last 40 years. So at some level, like I think that the evidence that we put together, complemented with other evidence, kind of like points out to the fact that there are losers from technology. I guess that like a bigger and more difficult question is whether these pockets of people who are losing, whether they translate into aggregate losses in employment or aggregate declines in wages. And that's something that we don't really have an answer to. But again, like I think that right now we do know that there are losers, and we have kind of like improved our thinking on our knowledge on who these people who are losing are and how much are they losing to these technologies.
Professor Savona, I think that relates nicely to your work. For instance, the Horizon 2020 funded project, which you have been co-leading, the Pillars or Pathways to Inclusive Labor Markets project. How does it relate to the comments of Professor Autor, Professor Restrepo?
Yeah, thanks, Koen. Yes, I mean, following from my esteemed colleagues, I think the ambition of Pillars was just started actually. So we're going to work on this for the next 3 years. Is to go a little bit beyond this, the two main focus of economists, which are basically the extent to which tasks have been replaced by robotization and AI and so on, which is obviously a crucial point, but also the issue of skill mismatch, for instance. And the idea would be to go beyond these two issues to look more in depth into the effect of past automation waves on industries. So we are interested in the heterogeneity of industry and the extent to which they are exposed to automation, AI, and robotization. Some industry will be more prone to adopt, to be exposed to automation. Some others will not. And therefore, the idea would be to understand how the impact of this will affect differences across industries, but also differences across regions, because ideally we take into account the initial specialization of regions and the extent to which automation would lead to industrial transformation, both within regions and to the extent they will be industries based in these regions will be involved into a global value chain. So we know that some effect of automation and digitalization more in general would be the extent to which global value chain and trades will change their function and specialization. So we're interested in basically these type of effects, which go a little bit beyond the main crucial issues that colleagues have been looking at. And also we take into account the effect on migration. So ideally at the individual level, these events, or these phenomena would lead to a global migration as well, depending on what kind of skills will be affected. So that's more or less the ambition of this project. And we are very keen into, as David was mentioning, we're very keen into trying to understand what would be the impact of future waves of automation technologies on industries. So that's more or less the ambition, and I look forward to share more.
Thank you. Professor Lehdonvirta, could you tell us more about this relates to your research and projects, such as the iLabor project?
Sure, thanks, Cohen. So one way of putting it is that if we can look at the way automation and the adoption of technology influences labor demand for different types of skills. Demand for some skills is going down and the demand for some other skills is going up. But we can also look at the effects of technology on labor market processes themselves. So the matching of demand with supply and the management of that labor supply. So for instance, the gig economy, food delivery apps, Uber and so on, is something that didn't really exist almost 10 years ago, but now is a massive sector of, well, I wouldn't say massive, but it's a significant segment of the labor market in many countries that employs a lot of people. And a lot of technology, a lot of automation is being used in these platforms to manage people and to match supply with demand. And what one of the things we're looking at and have been looking at for a while is how that impacts on things like job quality. So introduction of technology into these labor market processes could make things more flexible for workers. So it could allow work to be fitted better into different life circumstances for students, people who have caring responsibilities and so on, compared to strictly 9-to-5 jobs. But it can also result in uncertainty, in unpredictability, in the inability to make plans, and the inability to raise a family, for instance, because you don't know if you're going to be earning enough next week. So I think it's important to look at the effects of automation, not just on labor demand, but also on the matching and management of labor.
Thank you. In the second half of the interview, I would like to focus on a topic which I think combines each of your work, which is how to create more shared prosperity. It seems to me that there is increasing discussion whether the increasingly digital labor market and technologies as AI and robotics is actually leading to increasing shared prosperity instead of increased shared, increased disparity, so to say. For instance, a recent book was released recently by Daron Acemoglu titled Redesigning AI. And the main theme in this book is that there seems to be changes needed in a way in which we're implementing technologies as AI, since the current wave of implementation is not leading to shared prosperity. So I was therefore hoping that in the remainder of the interview, we could focus on the changes needed in both how we are implementing technologies as AI, the institutions surrounding them, and the digital labor market, especially the gig economy. And for that, I firstly had a question to Professor Autor. Could you tell us more about the changes which you think are needed to create more shared prosperity? For instance, some of the work you've been doing at the MIT Work of the Future.
Sure. So first of all, we've seen 4 decades of rising disparities and rising inequality, and this is true in all advanced economies, although to different degrees. And technology has certainly played a role in this, though not exclusively as well. Globalization has been important, institutions have been important, but clearly the set of technologies that we've been working with over the last 4 decades have been ones that have amplified the productivity and increased the scarcity of people with, analytical and interpersonal and high levels of educational skills, and made people with lower levels of education more replaceable and more redundant. And so this is a challenge that we have been facing, and not very successfully, in terms of shaping the direction of technology in a way that is more complementary. And it's something I think is sort of kind of undergirding this discussion, but I don't think any of us has quite said, is that it's not, the technologies don't just show up and then we just have to deal with them. We choose which technologies to invest in, and in some extent, which characteristics they have. And this is something that earlier work has emphasized, that, the emergence of new work is in some sense a function of a variety of investments that we make. And recent work that I've done with Anna Solomons and Brian Segmiller sort of shows that you can see where new work emerges, and partly it's a function of what innovations are we're making, and even where demand is growing. We see new skills and specialization. So the direction of investment and innovation has been highly focused on basically instruments, information, computing, electronics, and those things seem to be particularly complementary to highly educated workers. So I think there are two things to keep in mind when we think about the prosperity. One is affecting the investments we make that shape the tools we're using and the way that they will create work, create new work, replace work. And then the other, of course, is channeling the rising productivity that comes from that toward shared prosperity. Productivity growth has not been particularly impressive at all in most advanced economies, really since the mid 1970s. But that productivity growth, which we've seen, has been the fruits of that have been highly concentrated, have been have risen, have accrued mostly to the top. So we need to think about simultaneously the way we produce and the kind of structure of work, but also the set of norms and institutions that channel the fruits of those investments in a way that we feel good about or do not feel good about. And I would say the United States sort of stands out as a country that has been extremely laissez-faire in managing or not managing the consequences, and I think has generated an enormous amount of social dissatisfaction and frustration. And I would say the inaction has been costlier potentially than the set of interventions we might have made to attenuate or ameliorate that process.
Professor Savona, it seems to me that this also relates to the type of science, technology, and innovation policies which we are pursuing as a country. Can you give an example of policies which we could pursue to create more shared prosperity in the way that we innovate?
Thanks, Kuna. Allow me a small premise to this reply, if I may. Usually, innovation policy has been understood and has been crafted in a way that its main objective is to maintain incentives to innovate, in the understanding that at some point innovation is going to produce a social good or is going to be a public good. And to some extent it is, to the extent that it feeds the knowledge stock of societies and economies. Now, what has been possibly overlooked, and I think Pascual was hinting at this earlier on, is that there is always a side effect, or in most cases there is a side effect or a sort of trade-off that policy needs to mitigate. So I am a firm believer in the importance of public policy to direct the effects of innovation, and I think the way we should understand the way policy should be crafted is a sort of in its complexity. So taking into account issues of innovation policy without talking about industrial policy or redistributive policies is going to be a lose-lose situation. So this is my premise for what concerns innovation policy. So in a nutshell, we have innovation might be good, but there are side effects. So we need to mitigate the side effects. And this is something that it is important to incorporate in any policy decision. Now, if I may, possibly an orthodox example of what I mean is, for instance, one of the effects that Vili and I have also written in the high-level group report for the European Commission is one of the side effects of digitalization on the labor market is its effect on mental health. Now, mental health is extremely important. So I think that, for example, raising funds or recrafting funds for mental health in many countries would have not only mitigate the side effects of the disruptive effects of innovation on particular categories of workers, but to some extent might also lead to increase those soft skills, right, that are found to be very important for low-skilled people. So low-skilled workers are increasingly depending on unique soft skills that are valued in the labor market, and that, in my opinion, would very much benefit from higher public expenditure in mental health. It's a bit convoluted crafting, but I think the way I see policy intervention in this area is, incorporating this complexity.
Professor Lehdonvirta, how do you see this? And could you give examples on how we can create more shared prosperity, especially for those working at the lower end of the gig economy?
Thanks, Colin. That's a €1 million question. I would like to answer like a politician and sidestep the question of what the exact policies are a little bit, and answer that in addition to that, we also need to be thinking about how to actually implement those policies, because a lot of the research that, for instance, economists like David Autor here have done already points to things that should be done, but that governments are not doing. So as long as that remains the case, then developing even more sophisticated policy solutions is a little bit academic in a bad sense of the word. And what makes it particularly tricky today, the question of how to actually implement such policy changes, is that a lot of the power over working conditions and working arrangements is now in these large technology companies that operate across many countries. And so there's only so much you can do a lot of things by changing policies in a given country, but then often the technology companies are quite good at coming up with ways of tweaking their algorithms in ways that avoid triggering provisions in specific laws. When it comes to things like employment classification, for instance, there's debate about whether gig economy workers should be classified as regular employees and so on. And so I think that to some extent, then a more effective approach might be to think, how can we empower the workers themselves vis-a-vis the companies so that they are able to demand better conditions for themselves, whatever they think that they need, rather than policymakers necessarily coming top down and imposing policies that may or may not work for the workers and also for the companies. So one of the things that the European Union is now exploring, which I think is a good idea, is ensuring that there are no legal barriers to gig economy workers essentially unionizing, forming something like a union, even if they are not legally considered employees, but independent contractors. And by coming together, forming a union or an association, speaking back to the tech companies with a collective voice, and that way having a little bit more equal bargaining position in the table.
Professor Autor, how do you see this? I think, for instance, that at the MIT Work of the Future Task Force, that there was in their final report, was also a similar recommendation. I think you're still, yes.
Yes. Sorry, the question of worker organization, I'm sorry, I missed the antecedent.
Yes. Basically, what type of how can we create more shared prosperity, and to which extent should, for instance, be worker voice in companies be an aspect of that in, say, America, where it is, of course, quite limited currently?
In the United States, mechanisms for worker voice or worker leverage or even worker power have been hugely attenuated. And there was arguably a time where, U.S. labor unions were too strong and interfered with productivity and flexibility. And in some senses, they had the luxury of doing so when the U.S. was exposed to a lot less international competition. But now the pendulum has swung completely in the other direction. And this is problematic. The US, in my opinion, does very much need a revitalization of worker negotiating capacity, but not through the traditional mechanisms that we used. And the US labor system is historically and uniquely adversarial among advanced economies in a way that is, and it's trench warfare, right? It's like the equivalent of passing minimum wage laws, kind of one restaurant at a time, right? It's a workplace level bargain. It doesn't involve the sector and so on. So and many worker types are excluded: domestic workers, agricultural workers, and so on. So the U.S. needs to experiment, expand, and revitalize negotiation. I think worker negotiating power. I think that's part of the answer. I don't think that's all the answer, but it would also reverberate to how laws are made and who is elected. So it wouldn't simply be through workplaces, but through a broader change in political economy. So I definitely agree with the premise of the question. And I think this is a much more serious problem in the US and the UK than in most of continental Europe, more so than I think in the Netherlands, for example.
Thank you. Professor Restrepo, it seems to me that there might be too much automation. I think this was a focus of some of the papers. How do you think it also relates to some extent to worker voice, that there might be too much automation? How do you see this? Do you think that there is currently too much automation, or that we should have, say, changes in the tax structure, or what type of things are you seeing there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess that the question of whether you think that there's too much automation or not depends a little bit on the definition of shared prosperity that you have. Because we are talking about shared prosperity and how to achieve that, but we need to define what shared prosperity means first. So if I think of shared prosperity as just a situation where, as economies typically do, which is a situation where everyone has enough consumption or welfare from consumption, then it's very hard to have excessive automation, because automation brings some productivity gains, and then the only thing that I need to do is redistribute those productivity gains, right? And so that's the traditional view that we economies had in the past. Technology, it creates some winners and losers, but this is always good in terms of welfare because I can always tax the winner to compensate the losers, right? But if you think that that's your definition of shared prosperity, just the ability of people to consume enough, that could lead you to a situation where perhaps we have automation and we automate what 95% of the society does, and we end up in a place where 5% of the population produces all of the output, and the remaining 95% just receives a handout, right? So that doesn't strike me as a world where there's shared prosperity. I mean, there's shared consumption for sure, but there's no shared prosperity. So I think that it's useful to use a different definition of shared prosperity, which is a world where everyone, or a broad section of society from diverse origins and with diverse skills, take part in the production or in the creation of value. And if I start using the definition of shared prosperity, then you can start thinking about why, if our objective is to generate that kind of shared prosperity, why could there be too much automation? And the reason is because automation is essentially taking away opportunities for those segments of society and might not be generating other gainful employment opportunities for them in other sectors or in other kinds of jobs. So I think that that's useful, because if that's the way that you think about shared prosperity, definitely you need to think about different policies, such as innovation policy. And Maria was talking about this. So you need to be mindful that some innovations, even though they generate productivity, they might move us away from that world of shared prosperity because they take employment opportunity away from some groups of society. You might want to think about training and education, but I think that, and this is something that we can discuss more, but I think that there's a limit to how much training and education alone is going to get you. In the extreme, you could make all of society a computer programmer, but there's still going to be 5% of society who are better programmers than the rest. And so those 5% are going to be doing all of the coding. So I think that at some point, if you really want a society where everyone has access to gainful employment opportunities, and that's the objective, you need to start thinking about innovation policy, and you need to start thinking about including those concerns into what types of projects you subsidize and so on. So for example, in the NSF, every time that they're going to subsidize one particular project, I mean, I don't know how long have they been doing this, but recently they're asking proponents of projects to also spend some time discussing what are the societal implications of the innovations that they plan to bring. And I think that that's kind of like a step in the right direction. We should be managing this the same way that we manage the climate, right? Like we agreed that it's desirable to create green energies. So we are subsidizing green energies and we are taxing carbon. And so like, I guess that in this sense is if we all agree that perhaps automation is not the path for shared prosperity, the way that I define it, we should kind of like be redirecting innovation in another direction. And David already pointed out that kind of like technology is not that it comes in one shape and that's it. We decide as society how we want to develop AI, for example. We can decide whether we want to use AI to generate other platforms that generate lots of employment for low-skilled workers, or if we decide whether we want to use AI to keep automating more jobs in a way that we have been doing in the last 40 years with software and robotics. So at some level, it's a societal choice.
And if I can just add one thing to what Pascual just said, even if you thought the world in which, all the money was made in one place and then everyone received a check, even if you thought it was desirable, which I agree with the implication that it's not at all desirable, it's not politically viable, right? It's just not feasible to have a society where all the resources are coming from one place and then somehow the state takes ownership and redistributes it and that works okay, right? In some sense, you need people to have some income generating capability, to have a functioning democracy that doesn't, in which people will agree to the redistributive outcomes. So I think there are many reasons to think that we do not want to be in a setting where, like kind of the resource course where all the money comes from oil, right? And then we all try to share the oil wealth. That never works well.
Thank you. It seems to me that it also relates a bit to some aspects that Professor Lehdonvirta worked on. For instance, his more sociological work. For instance, also on the importance of work and especially in the how people earn incomes and such and the policies surrounding that. Could you expand on that, Professor Lehdonvirta?
I'm not sure which work you're referring to.
I was thinking the work, for instance, on Southeastern Asia. On I think you focused on workers there, and yeah, could you expand on that perhaps? Does it also relate to this context?
Well, I can talk about that that research, but let me try and think of how to make it relevant here. Well, I mean, one thing. Okay, here's something that's interesting because a lot of this, and I totally agree with what Professor Autor there was saying, and Professor Restrepo as well. The one additional challenge that digital technologies are bringing to the table is that sometimes the work crosses national boundaries. So we studied people in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, my colleagues at the Oxford Internet Institute and myself, who earn income from employers in European countries and the United States, Canada, and Japan, and rich OECD economies, doing work like software development, web design, graphic design, data entry, and so on, and some virtual assistant services. And they are matched with the employers through online platforms. And when the work crosses national boundaries like this, it becomes quite tricky to regulate it in the context of essentially world system that's based on these territorial jurisdictions, units of regulation. There are some, first of all, there's practical legal issues. Which of is it the employer's country or the worker's country, which laws should be applied? And even if, and the lawyers can figure this out and they can tell you which is the correct answer, but even if you know that you ought to be applying the law of one country, then can you in practice enforce those laws? So for example, I spoke with a virtual assistant in the Philippines. And let's say this virtual assistant doesn't get, he has a London-based client. The client doesn't pay. Wage theft, very common in these markets, unfortunately. Is it feasible really for the Filipino virtual assistant to take the client to court in London? No, it's even if it was legally possible, it's economically not viable. So there's a kind of institutional void in a way in these transnational markets, and the platform companies are stepping in, these digital platforms, they're stepping in and they're filling that void to some extent. So they're providing rules and they're providing rule enforcement that allows these transnational markets to function. And what that means for us when we think about policy is that it's not necessarily sufficient to just think of policy within a territorial jurisdiction. You also need to think about, okay, well, how can we influence policy in these transnational sort of virtual jurisdictions?
Professor Savona, how does that relate to your work?
When Vili was mentioning this, I was actually thinking about it's related to digital transformation, and is related to the governance of data. So this is something that it's increasingly important. It's increasingly debated at the EU versus US and China. Jurisdiction and regulation. It is important because there is a lot to be understood in terms of redistribution of data value. And if we think that this is mentioned, for example, in the high-level report that we produce with Vili, but there's a lot to be done. For example, personal data are individual data are then gathered at the platform level, and they become property as a database of the company. And this raises issues related to property rights, for instance, issues related to digital cross-border data flows. And all this needs to be assessed, and to some extent, it has to do with the rights and the agency that people have on their own personal data that then become so much valuable for large tech. And I think there's a whole gap that needs to be unpacked here. And in this respect, we need so much interdisciplinary expertise. I think we need from economists to lawyers and to sociologists and so on. So this is one, for example, one of the examples that I meant earlier, where policy is so complex that needs to be incorporating different kind of expertise because it needs to tackle different issues at stake. So a lot more on the political economy of data.
Professor Lehdonvirta, could you expand on some of the recommendations of the high-level expert group on the impact of the digital transformation, which you and Savona were on? Could you expand on some of the tips which you made for the European Union? What are the most important changes?
Well, let me pick one. I mean, we made 10 different recommendations. Professor Savona was part of that group with me, and one of them was related to this, ensuring that there's no legal impediments to gig workers forming union-like associations and bargaining collectively. But another one that's related to data that was just discussed is this idea of what we termed the digital single window, which would be a facility for EU governments to receive data from platform companies directly for the purposes of taxation and social insurance administration. So at the moment, there is a risk that, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just that robotization, automation is replacing workers, but it's replacing managers. It's replacing labor market intermediaries. And there is a risk that as that happens and the labor markets sort of move online and they become increasingly digitalized, then the state falls out of the loop because the state has hooks built into, sort of data hooks built into conventional labor market processes and conventional management processes where the state gets data on how much people are earning and what their employment status is like. Which is very important, especially in European welfare states where we rely on taxes and we rely on that data to produce data for the purposes of social insurance, for pensions and for unemployment insurance and so on. And now if the labor market moves into this new digital sort of infrastructure, and that data, those data access hooks are left behind, then you have a problem where there might be tax underreporting, and in fact, we know that there is some tax underreporting, and there might be under coverage of social insurance. So we have a lot of people working in the gig economy who are making decent earnings now, but what they might not realize that later on they might not be covered for pensions, and then that falls on the state ultimately to fix that problem for them. And so we have a kind of liability waiting for us in the future if we don't fix that problem now. And so one of the things we proposed in this high-level group report was a facility for European member states to obtain data directly from those platform companies on what people are earning and what people are doing, rather than relying on workers reporting it themselves. And in fact, then I and some colleagues, we did a follow-up study on this, and we found that several European member states already, in a national context, they're building systems like this. So for instance, Denmark has introduced an API, an application programming interface. The tax agency has introduced an API for platform companies to report in real time what people are earning. Especially for accommodation rental platforms, but the plan is to expand it also to labor platforms. And it turns out that in a country like Denmark, with people like their welfare state and they have good tax morale, the platform companies and the users, they actually welcomed this, and a lot of platform companies said that they wanted to get early access to this reporting interface because it made the reporting easier for their users, because it meant that now the users didn't have to, if you rent your apartment or you do some work through one of these platforms and you gain some income, and in the present situation, you're supposed to report that income to the state via some paperwork, which is usually intended for essentially businesses, because now it's considered business income. You're an independent contractor, so the paperwork is quite heavy, and it's not something that a gig worker who does a little bit of gig work as a side income necessarily knows how to fill in, and it's quite a big compliance cost to fill in that paperwork, versus a system where the platform actually reports directly that income to the state. It makes it super easy for the workers. So this policy was very much welcomed in Denmark, and we proposed that something like this should be done on a union level.
Professor Restrepo, in Professor Lehdonvirta's beginning of his answer, he also talked a bit about automation in this context. How do you see this? What do you think about his comments?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part of the question.
What do you think about his comments, especially at the beginning?
Yeah, so I mean, like, I'm not a specialist in terms of data, and I think that most of his comments were about like how to handle data and all of that. So I'll have to pass on that question, because like I have to say that I agree with him, because he's the expert on this.
Thank you. I think we're already quite close to time, so I think it might be good to move towards the closing questions. And I think it's best to do this in the same order as the beginning statements, and we have then a bit more time, so we can also go a bit more in detail. So we always have the same question at the end of this interview, and this is, if you could say one thing to students in economics related to the topics we discussed today, what will that be? And the question I first have for Professor Autor.
Well, let's see. I mean, I think, an important thing that Pascual emphasized in his comments is that, and many of us did, is there's so much we have to learn. And we really, we are very far from a settled understanding of these questions. They're momentous. And it's not just a question of research, but also they influence what we do. And it's not just, many people think when they're trying to study, quote, the future, that they're trying to, it's an act of prediction. But in fact, the future is something that's in our control. And so it's not just a matter of anticipating, it's a matter of shaping. And the way we do that is by, understanding what we've done in the past and what levers we have to, produce the outcomes we want going forward. And So I think it's more than just a kind of a scholarly exercise. It's a really vital exercise. I also want to emphasize one point that probably didn't come out as clearly from this conversation, which is, economists in particular have gone from the position of being, with no caveats, incredibly positive about technology and automation, to being quite pessimistic about it without necessarily achieving an appropriate balance between those two. And we should recognize that there are winners and losers, but the net effects can be quite beneficial. It's hard to think how we would have come through this pandemic over the last couple of years had it not been for online tools that allow us to carry out our work, had it not been for the incredible progress in medical technology that allowed most of us to be vaccinated by now, or even the way that technology has led to growing prosperity around the developing world. And it's very easy from a kind of rich country perspective to say, well, things aren't improving that fast, not as good as they used to be. But of course, think about the value of mobile technology in sub-Saharan Africa and many developing countries where there's no close substitute for the banking, the communication, the information access that's available through technology, or even the way that China's rise has brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, not only in China, but throughout the developing world. And that has both a kind of a political and economic component and also a technological component. So I think we should simultaneously realize that we are creating challenges for ourselves. They're important. We have control over them. And there are many ways to do this wrong. But simultaneously, we wouldn't want to not face this problem. We wouldn't want to not have the opportunity to use these technologies and use them well. And clearly, there's enormous potential for benefit and a lot of good is occurring. It's often, unfortunately, the case that the people who are the beneficiaries are not the same ones who are as the people who are on the side of being affected directly by automation.
Thank you. Professor Restrepo, for you the same question. If there's one thing you could say, and feel free to expand a bit here, to students in economics related to the topics we discussed today, what will that be?
Yeah, so I think that I would basically say every single word that David just said, but I would add some more notes on top of that. So the first thing that I would tell to students who are interested in these topics is that these are some of the most important and consequential questions that an economist or in general an academic can be thinking about these days, because as David pointed out, these are questions about kind of like what kind of future we want to live in. So yes, we tend to study the past because it's the only thing that we observe, but we are studying the past in order to learn about our future. And that I think is very consequential and very important. And the second thing that I would point out to students is that, at least in the economics profession, we tend to have a view of technology where we put all technologies together into a single thing and just call it technology and think that that's always good for prosperity or for shared prosperity, as we have been discussing. And I think that my invitation for students is to kind of like open that black box of technology. There are many different technologies, and technologies do very different things. So there's the technology that, for example, powers one of the platforms that can hire thousands of workers during the pandemic, right? That's one type of digital technology, and we want to understand what are the effects of that particular technology and whether that technology is being used in the right way. There's other technologies that are really just about automation, and there are other technologies that are about new materials, new products. So, we tend to think of we tend to call a lot of things automation. We tend to call a lot of things technology. I think that it is useful to start distinguishing the fact that technology is very rich and that different technologies do different things and have different implications for society. And so we shouldn't be just talking about like automation in general or technology in general. There are many different types of technologies that we need to understand. And so that's part of my invitation to students. Let's open the black box of technology. It's not just kind of like a TFP, a solo residual thing that makes the economy grows. Different technologies do different stuff.
Thank you. Professor Savona, for you the same question. If there's one thing you could say to students in economics watching today, what would that be?
Yeah, I think my recommendation follows nicely from what Pascual was saying. My recommendation would be try not to become slave of disciplinary protocols. I mean, many economists have, all of us have some sort of disciplinary sense of belonging, right? That leads us to have a sort of standardized protocols of research. And my recommendation would be try to get into cross boundaries. Like if you get interested, for example, in ethical concerns about AI, or regulation about AI, try to read law and incorporate law into your research. If you're interested, for example, in as I said, in one of the issues that is going to grow, I think, is in the mental health impact of digitalization, then trying to expand on issues that are related to psychology or sociology. If you're interested, for example, in data governance and so on, just try to expand in different areas. Or if you want to unpack, as Pascual was saying, what kind of automation we're talking about, if you're interested in trying to understand what kind of task is going to be replaced from a surgeon replacing a broken bone, then try to read engineering journals on that particular type of product. And this, to me, is the one recommendation that I would have. Try to be interdisciplinary, starting from one well-known discipline, but try to enlarge to something that allows you to follow your curiosity and your research instinct. That's all.
Thank you. I think this is something we really hear throughout the series. For you, Professor Lehdonvirta, for you, the very final question, this the same one as to all the other panelists. If there's one thing you could say to students in economics watching today, what would that be?
We all have a limited number of years on this planet, and we spend a lot of those years working. But time use researchers, so sociologists who study how we spend our lives, tell us that we spend over the course of our lives as much time on unpaid work, on domestic chores, on caring for other people as we do in the paid labor market. And so far, this whole future of work discussion has focused solely on the paid labor market. So next, let's think about how about that other half of work, that work that happens in the domestic sphere, and that's just as vital for the reproduction of society.
Thank you. Thank you each for your time. This was the final episode of the series, and I want to thank each of the panelists also throughout the entire series so much for their time. It was a very interesting conversation. Thank you.